made of. And now, finally, I'm going to end with a few remarks about biology, more specifically the kind of biology that theoretical physicists are interested in, which might be called theoretical biology, except that biologists tend to give me trouble, or if we talk about theoretical biology, they talk about systems biology or things like that. They don't like the word theory, but physicists do. And they have, over the last few years, decade or more, been more and more turning to study living matter. The distinction, of course, between biology and physics is absurd. Helmholtz, in the last 2 centuries ago now, was a physicist or a biologist or both. But these distinctions get created by university departments. And living matter, as we just heard in the last lecture, is incredibly complex and exhibits the marvelous property of self-organization and creation of patterns. And this is something that physicists have been interested in and have studied in inorganic or non-living matter for many years, and they think they might have something to contribute. And in fact, at my Institute of Theoretical Physics now, about 20% of our activities are in what might be called theoretical biology, or not biophysics as much, where you have physicists having some instrument or tool and trying to apply it to a biological system, but rather theorists or physicists who become interested in biology and the questions posed by nature and come simply with their arsenal of way of thinking that characterizes physics. But it's not clear that there is a theory of biology, that there are universal phenomena, that there are explanations of the type that physicists are accustomed to. And many biologists will argue that biology, or what we observe in the living matter on our planet, is a product of, it's of course a product of natural selection, but it is a historical accident that you have no chance of constructing a theory of. But others would argue that they're bound to be universal features. Who knows? Can theoretical physicists help? Well, they certainly will be more likely to help if there is a theory, universal features and laws. Is new mathematics required? This is an interesting question. Some of my physicist friends who've moved into biology believe that new mathematics will be needed. In fact, old mathematics, or mathematics, developed over the centuries together with physics. Calculus was invented by Newton to solve, to understand, calculate the orbits of planets. Partial differential equations were evolved in the 19th century with field theory and heat conduction and so on. Mathematics developed together with physics and in response to the natural world, but mostly the non-living matter natural world. Perhaps to describe living organisms, new mathematics will be required. There's one reason that might be so, and why living systems are so different than the systems that physicists have tended to study and understand. And that is that biological systems have dynamics over many, many wide-ranging timescales. That's, in physics, we're used to, and we've made progress by being able to make a separation of scales. So as previous lectures didn't have to worry about what went on inside the nucleus. It was irrelevant, and in fact the chemists barely have to worry about what goes on inside atoms. And so there's a clear separation in studying physical, we're able to separate these scales and make progress. If in order to understand chemistry one had to understand nuclear physics, it would have taken a lot longer, believe me. But in biology, there's dynamics over many different scales, especially in the time domain. For example, I am talking to you now, and there are chemical reactions going on in the synapses of your neurons, if you're not sleeping, that act on a very short, microsecond, less time scale. And they might very well, I hope, imprint themselves on that cell, processes that take sometimes days to finalize the creation of a memory. And you might remember in 10 years from now this lecture and say, oh, I remember Gross said that and that. He was totally wrong. So what I say now and the chemical reactions that are occurring over on atomic timescales in your brain might affect your behavior 10 years from now. This is an incredible wide range of scales that occur in a biological organism. And we're not used to, and we probably don't have the correct mathematics to deal with such systems. Genomics is an area where theorists of various types and theoretical physicists among them have been attracted simply because there's so much data. Once you publish the data, anybody can use it, and you could figure out how it all works given the genomic code, which has been deciphered. But is there really a theory here? Can you make a theory of evolution and not just observe it or observe the past? And can you actually predict the future? Well, you can do experiments, you can try. I don't think the answer to this is known, how quantitative and how predictive the evolution of living matter can be made, but I suspect that one can be a lot more quantitative and predictive than one has in the past. I like to phrase another aspect of this by asking this question: can one tell the shape of an organism by looking at its genome? It's all in there somehow. And I imagine Theoretical Genomics 101 final exam in about 100 years from now. This is the final exam. Problem 1, based on this genetic sequence, draw a picture of the organism. And this is the answer. I don't know, maybe. And finally, neuroscience. Neuroscience is an area where theoretical physicists have been interested for many decades. It's one area of biology where even biologists admit there has to be a theory. You can't get started in discussing how the brain works without creating a model. You're not going to get very far just by observation. And so even just to deal with the data that you get by various ways of mapping the brain and its circuits or recording signals from it, you need to model the brain. So it's a great place for theoretical physicists. Some of them were at this conference, and these questions came from them, not from me, but they're wonderful. The obvious question that physicist types have been asking for a long time are trying to understand the principles of self-organization, which are most advanced in the brain, and are responsible for things like memory, which is very complicated, and even more so consciousness, whatever that is. And another question that was asked by a Nobel laureate condensed matter physicist, Phil Anderson, was, can one make a machine with free will, with teleonomic behavior? Or, as a prelude to next talk, can one make a machine that has ethics, that faces ethical dilemmas? And finally, can one measure the onset of consciousness in an infant? Now, this is a question that I particularly like because most neuroscientists don't like to talk about consciousness unless they've had a few drinks. And how do you approach? It's a very complicated concept, clearly much more primitive than it will turn out to be. But the way one of the physicists asked the question about consciousness that doesn't require knowing what consciousness is. Can you measure the onset of consciousness in an infant? So the way I think about this is I plot consciousness versus age. And obviously, most of us will agree that an embryo somewhere along its line of development doesn't have consciousness, isn't conscious. And most of us will also agree that a teenager is probably conscious. So somewhere in between what we call consciousness turns on. And physicists often approach complex systems not by trying to really understand the brain of an embryo, or certainly not of a teenager, but trying to discuss the transition, the phase transition between these two different states. The simplest kind of question one could ask is the transition discontinuous? Does the consciousness suddenly turn on? Or is it continuous? Now, this is an interesting question because it provokes, well, we don't know what consciousness is, so how can you measure it? Well, measure some correlate. And you can do this across species. There's a whole avenue of research possible. And I think it's characteristic of the way a physicist would approach the problem of what is consciousness.